it was just a belief that I had that every child, regardless of where they are born, whether it's Mountain Brook or Boology, regardless of what part of the state they're born in or who their parents are, the color of the skin, or whether they're citizens or not, that every child ought to have the right to reach their God-given potential through education.
Yeah.
And you know that opportunity and success has to start with education, and you have to start with preschool.
Hey everyone, welcome to Set in Stone, where we are setting in stone the foundational principles of everything related to government, social justice, politics, all the things under the sun. This is our The South Got Something to Say series, and I am so excited for this episode where I am talking to a phenomenal man. And before I introduce him, I'm going to read his bio. Okay. The Honorable Don Siegelman served as the last Democratic governor of the state of Alabama. He attended public schools in Mobile, Alabama, where he received his bachelor's degree from the University of Alabama in 1968, his law degree from Georgetown in 1972, and he did postgraduate studies in international law at the University of Oxford in England from 1972 to 1973. He also served in the National Guard and while in law school worked for the Department of Justice as a United States Capitol Hill policeman. And in 1973, he began his practice with his political mentor, Robert S. Vance Sr., and organized Bob Vance's opposition to Governor Wallace's attempted takeover of the Alabama Democratic Party in 1974. He was elected Secretary of State in 1978, Attorney General in 1986, Lieutenant Governor in 1994, and Governor in 1999. He is the only person in Alabama history to have held all statewide constitutional offices. And in these positions, he expanded voting rights, opened the door to the election of thousands of African Americans by settling the Dillard versus Crenshaw County case, forcing cities and counties to adopt single-member districts. He filed more environmental lawsuits in 8 months that had been filed in 8 years. He saved the Mobile Delta by organizing the purchase of 150,000 acres, now dedicated as public lands. He further protected our environment by banning deep well injection of hazardous waste. He also stopped offshore incineration of hazardous waste and ending offshore disposal of hazardous waste, and passed legislation to protect women and children from domestic violence. As governor from 1999 to 2003, Siegelman dedicated himself to improving K-12 education and initiated over 1,000 new school construction projects. He put in place the largest road and bridge construction project in Alabama's history and brought in automobile plants, including Toyota, Mercedes, Hyundai, and 2 Honda plants, creating more than 100,000 automotive jobs. After Governor Siegelman was touted as someone who, like Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, could break the Republican stronghold on Southern electoral votes, Alabama suddenly became a brutal political battleground. While advocating for a state lottery to fund education, Siegelman found himself under state and federal investigation initiated by forces connected to Karl Rove. Congressman John Lewis had this to say about Governor Siegelman's prosecution. Don Siegelman, Alabama's first progressive governor, was elected with a majority of black and white voters. He advanced the cause of justice for African Americans and women, appointing more African Americans as judges than had been elected or appointed in Alabama's history. This drove Republicans crazy. The coup de grace was that Governor Siegelman was going to give free college education and free early learning to all of Alabama's children. This led to a stolen election, being wrongfully charged and convicted and sentenced to prison for 78 months for something that the New York Times, legal scholars, and 113 former state attorney generals deemed was not a crime. Governor Siegelman even had to say this about his own case. How our justice system went wrong in my case was a catalyst for my conversion on the death penalty and my passion for ending prosecutorial abuse of power to protect our democracy. In 2020, Governor Siegelman released a nonfiction book, Stealing Our Democracy, which became #1 new release on Amazon in 2020, and is available either in hard copy or Audible at Amazon. Most recently, Governor Don Siegelman started a nonprofit called Advocates for Justice and works with organizations that strive for criminal justice reform. He is a black belt in karate, does volunteer work with Juarez Boxing for people with Parkinson's disease, and has recently organized a payoff of a $9 million medical debt owed by 17,000 people in Alabama's Black Belt and in other areas with similar demographics. He currently lives in Birmingham, Alabama with his family. Governor Don Siegelman.
Hey there,
How are you?
Khadidah. It's good to see you again. It's been a long time since the Democratic Convention. but
Yes.
It's great to see you again.
I'm so glad to be here. I really appreciate you calling me.
I had to call you. You said call me.
You know I did.
That's right.
So thank you so much. I don't want to hold you long because I know you're a busy man. So I'm going to dive right into the questions. First, I want to start with how did your experiences growing up in Mobile, Alabama shape you into the man you are today?
Good question. I'm going to give you two specific examples. My mother was sort of the religious rock of the family, and she would make my older brother and me go to Sunday school, whether we wanted to or not, every Sunday. Mm-hmm. But one Saturday we were shopping in downtown Mobile, and my mother said, "Do you see that old lady standing at the corner?" And I guess I was 9 or 10 years old. And I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "I want you to go up to her and ask her if you can help her cross the street." So I said, and she said, "Hold her hand as you cross the street." So I did, and we crossed the street together. And my mother said, "Well, how did that feel?" And I said, "Well, she was old." No, she said, I meant, how did it make you feel? Did it make you feel good? Mm-hmm. But what she was trying to show me was that good deeds are more than just going to church on Sunday. That you had to do something with your life. Mm-hmm. One day after school, the second example, one day after school, my dad was home unexpectedly. He never got home from work before 6:30, but he was there that day about 3:30. Mm-hmm. And he said, "Donnie, I heard you use an inappropriate word this morning with your mother." And I kind of knew what he was talking about. It was right after Brown versus Board of Education, and there was a lot of talk at school, and I had used the N-word with my mother. Mm. She had told my dad. My dad came home early. He said, we sat at the kitchen table where we always had discussions, and he said, "I want you to go get our dictionary." A dictionary we had bought with S&H green stamps. Back in those days, you could get things, if you saved up enough stamps from the grocery store. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I got the dictionary. His dad said, "I want you to find that word in the dictionary." So I dutifully thumbed through trying to find it, and he said, "Let me give you a hint. It's not in there. Mm-hmm. The word is Negro, and that's the only word we ever use." Mm-hmm. But he went beyond that, and he said, "I want you to address every Negro man as sir, and every Negro woman as ma'am." And he explained that might cause a problem back in those days. But anyway, that's the way I was raised.
Wow, that's amazing for your parents to have stood up in a time when that wasn't. A lot of people weren't doing that. Just they were good people. Yeah, they were amazing. Yeah. Well, the next question is, did that experience inspire you to want to run for public office?
Well, it was good training. I remember as a high school student volunteering to help at the Greater Gulf State Fair. There were people, young people who had physical impairments, and we were helping them. We were assigned to them to help them get on rides. And the young lady that I was helping was was probably 12 or 13, and I was, I guess, 16. But she was in a wheelchair, and I think, just helping her and seeing the the joy that it brought her to have someone help, it just further inspired me to want to do things in my life that were helpful to others.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, the next question is, so you're still the only politician in Alabama today that has run for Secretary of State, Attorney General, Lieutenant Governor, and Governor. And so I want to talk about like campaign specifics before we talk about those roles.
Sure.
So what, out of those positions, what statewide campaign was the most challenging and why?
The first Secretary of State. I was, there hadn't been a male Secretary of State in over 100 years, I think. It was close.
Oh, wow.
This was my first race, but I felt confident that if I worked hard enough, and met enough people, I could put together an organization that would help me get elected. So running scared, I did I spoke at every Democratic organization, every county, every ADC meeting, any civil rights organization that I could get into to speak. I went through every courthouse from top to bottom, most city halls, the large ones, and would go in and just introduce myself, saying, I'm Don Siegelman, running for Secretary of State. I hope you'll vote for me. Mm-hmm. And I'd leave a flyer, but I worked extremely hard, and I think that's one of the problems that young people miss today is, social media, of course, plays an important part in the dissemination of information. But in terms of forming relationships with people that will bond people to you, regardless of political party or, whether they're liberal or conservative, is a personal relationship. Mm-hmm. So meeting people, one-on-one makes a huge difference. And I took almost a full year off to campaign every day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so It was a lot of hard work, but I think that was the most challenging.
Yeah, and you were only 28, right?
Yes.
Okay, so did your experience being SGA president, because where were you SGA president at? I know you
Alabama at Tuscaloosa.
So do you think that experience, and then I don't know if you did you do any leadership things while you were at University of Oxford?
I did. I got actively involved in politics while I was SGA president, and I worked for Charles Evers, and when he was the first black to run for governor in Mississippi.
Yes.
I did national voter registration and delegate selection work, and we had 47 states organized. And I worked in a congressional campaign in 1968 and 1972, and then coming back and running this campaign for Bob Vance to be elected chairman in Alabama, again, put me in every county in Alabama and established contacts for me. So I had something of a background before I ran for Secretary of State.
Yeah, so would you say that, it sounds like that experience built and helped you not only build but also maintain coalitions across the state, or? It
put me in touch with the leadership of organizations. Again, in those days, it was you had labor organizations, black political organizations, the teachers, and so working as I did, particularly with the Democratic Party, kept me in touch with the leadership of those organizations.
Yeah, I love that. So the next question is, were there I guess, how did your campaign strategies evolve from your first statewide race to your later campaigns? And like, what did that look like? Because I mean, you learned something from, each campaign, and like, what was that like for you?
Each campaign is really dramatically different in terms of strategy. I was Secretary of State for 2 terms, and I wanted to jump from there to the U.S. Senate. So I had planned to run for the Democratic nomination for the U.S. Senate in 1986, rather than running for Attorney General. But my wife and I were in a really horrible car accident. We were hit head-on by a drunk driver, and it nearly, cost me the chance to have my family as I have today. And shortly after the accident, I guess several months after the accident, my wife got pregnant with our first child, Dana, and I decided that being in the United States Senate would be bad for my family, because I would be in Washington 4 or 5 days a week, and on the weekends I knew myself, I would be out on the streets campaigning in some far off part of the state. So James Carville was my consultant at the time, and he helped me transition from U.S. Senate to running for Attorney General. And I think because I ran a strong campaign against drugged and drunk drivers, and had this personal relationship with that, that tragedy, the tragedy that can come from a crash with a drunk driver, I was able to run and win the Attorney General.
Yeah, I love that. So we're going to skip over and talk about the individual roles that you had, and I'm going to start with the first one, which is Secretary of State. So you were only 28. Like, I can't get over that. Maybe it's because I'm 28, but like that's like really young. So like, were you met with like opposition of like people saying, "Oh, he's too young. He's too young"? I mean, like, was that a thing?
I was young, I had long hair. I mean, I was not sort of beetle length hair, longer sideburns. But I had such energy and passion, and I was moving throughout the state, and far out organized my opposition. The criticism of being too young really didn't make any difference, because I made up for that by my energy in campaigning.
Yeah, I love that. So during your time as Secretary of State, what were your key priorities and accomplishments?
Well, I had headed up the state Democratic Party's effort to change our election laws, so I focused on that. And one of those, the 4 areas that we were focused on with the Democratic Party, and also my focus as Secretary of State, started with voter registration, making voter registration more accessible. In those days, you could only register at the courthouse when the courthouse was open, and only when the boards of registrars happened to be at the courthouse. So even though the courthouse might be open from 8 to 5, there was no guarantee that if you showed up at the Autauga County Courthouse or the Dallas County Courthouse, that there would be a member of the Board of Registrars there to register you. So we took on issues like that and turned it into a common sense strategy. We said that, since probate judges are at the courthouse all the time, why not allow the people to register with the probate judge as well as the secretary, as well as the Board of Registrars, because we knew that they would be there from 8 to 5. Yeah. And then we pushed for the deputy registrars, so that anyone could go into the Board of Registrars and could become a deputy registrar. We did that to make it easier for people who worked for a living, members of organized labor, for example, to become registered. And then we changed the absentee voting laws to allow people who voted outside their precinct. It had been if you had to vote outside of the county in order to get an absentee ballot, but we changed it so that if you're outside of your precinct on election day, you can vote absentee.
Oh, wow.
And then we brailled ballots. We put ballots on cassettes for the hearing impaired or the
Wow.
people who were blind.
Yeah.
And we made voting places accessible before the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. So
Oh, wow. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
had a lot of fun.
Yeah. So how did that experience shape your understanding about Alabama's electoral system? I mean, you obviously went in with the plan, but how did it, I guess, change your thought in that?
Well, I became a target of some of the conservatives in the Alabama legislature because we were opening the door to more black people registering to vote. And it made me realize that there was going to be a battle. For example, this one state legislator who was chairman of the House Rules Committee, I believe, his name was Lee Pegues from Pickens County or Perry County, wanted to pass legislation that would have required everybody in that county to have re-registered before the election, which meant, and that, both of those counties at the time were probably 70% black, and so by wiping the slate clean, it would have given him the opportunity to get, his votes from these other counties, which were largely white. So
Yeah.
my comment on that was, maybe in Russia, but not in Alabama. So we put a stop to it, and he was defeated at the next election. So.
Right, as he should be.
Right.
So what inspired your transition? I know you spoke about it a little bit, but from Secretary of State to Attorney General. I know you said you wanted to go after U.S. Senate, but were there anything other parts that also inspired that transition?
No, it was really just wanting to make sure I was home with my daughter is more than I would have been had I been out of state as a U.S. Senator. So
Yeah.
it was strictly a family decision.
Okay, awesome. So during your term as Attorney General, what were your most significant cases and issues you addressed?
Well, the two most important, I think, was intervening and settling this case. John Dillard, who was chairman of the Alabama Democratic Conference in Crenshaw County, had challenged single-member districts, whereby, or at large districts, where the county commission or city council would run at large, which diluted black voting strength. And so we forced all cities and all counties to adopt single-member districts, which, again, opened the door for really thousands of black candidates to run for office in Alabama. And it was clearly the most significant political shift in the state at that time.
Yeah.
And the second thing was just filing environmental lawsuits and stopping the Alabama from becoming a dumping ground for toxic waste.
Yeah, I love that. So what challenges did you face enforcing state laws during your time as Attorney General?
Filing environmental lawsuits against Alabama companies raised a lot of concern by many of the large companies who were violating violating federal Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. In fact, Robert Kennedy Jr. came down while I was Attorney General, and at that point he was very active in the anti-pollution, pro-environmental effort, but there was opposition, but the companies all knew that they were caught. I mean, we had the data that indicated they were violating federal law and Alabama law. So we were able to get them to agree to a settlement.
Yeah. Okay. So now I'm gonna transition and talk about your position as Lieutenant Governor. What inspired you to go from Attorney General to Lieutenant Governor?
Well,
at this point, were your eyes set on Governor?
Well, it was. In fact, I ran after my stint as Attorney General. I ran for the Democratic nomination for governor in 1990. I lost to Paul Hubbard, who then lost to Guy Hunt. So I was out of politics from 90 to 94, and I had a couple of friends who came to me and said, "Hey, you need to get back into it. You know, you've been Secretary of State and Attorney General. Don't let this one loss deter you from running again." And the lieutenant governor's race was going to be open. It would be a open seat with no incumbent. So I started giving some thought to running for lieutenant governor. It was going to be a battle, a brutal, brutal battle, because the president pro tem of the Senate, Ryan DeGraffenreid, whose father was a congressman, was going to run. Roger Bedford, a popular state senator who was real close to the trial lawyers, was going to run. George Wallace Jr. was running.
Oh, wow.
And I think there was one district attorney from somewhere who wanted to run. And then on the Republican side, the Republicans had their strongest horse in the barn, Charlie Craddock, who had been Attorney General, who had a Democrat, who had won the Democratic nomination for governor, but it was stripped from him by the Democratic Committee, the Democratic Executive Committee in Alabama, and then the nomination was given to Bill Baxley, who ran and lost against Guy Hunt as well. But the challenge was going to be enormous, raising money and running against all these well-known political figures.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you won.
But I won.
You won. So what were your priorities as Lieutenant Governor?
Well, it was, they were both some priorities of mine, and also it was a positive and negative. The lieutenant governor has an enormous amount of power, or did, because the lieutenant governor got to appoint the members of all of the standing committees in the Senate, and served as president of the Senate, so you had the gavel. So the first thing that I wanted to do was to put money, millions of dollars, $10 million into the budget to fully fund the Children's Health Initiative program that Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton had pushed through Congress. I met opposition from the then Governor Fob James and the Speaker of the House, Jimmy Clark. Both of them said, we're not going to do this. We're not going to let that $10 million be spent on health care for children. And I said, well, gentlemen, guess what? Your budget's not going to make it out of the committee in the Senate.
Yikes.
So they passed their budget without the $10 million. I put it in one of our committees, and it came out with the $10 million. And I said, take it or leave it. You have to either give me what I need to fully fund this CHIPS program.
Yeah.
Or you don't get your budget passed. So anyway, we got it done, and on the negative side, the conservatives wanted to pass a ban on punitive damages, even when someone was seriously injured or killed in a car wreck. They were trying to protect businesses from large punitive damage awards, which had been coming out of some of the counties in Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
And
wait, can you explain punitive damages?
So if you're in if you have a dispute and you've lost money as a result of fraud,
mm-hmm.
You're entitled to get that money back. That's compensatory damages.
Mm-hmm.
But if they lied or cheated or misrepresented something to you, which resulted in that loss, then the punitive damages are awarded to try to send a message to that company and to anybody else that, hey, if you do this again, it's not just going to be compensating this person for the $10,000 they lost, but we're gonna tag on punitive damages of $10 million to send a message to you. So
mm-hmm.
they wanted to stop punitive damages for everything, and so we had that battle, and again I won.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up Governor Bob James, because I was going to ask, how was that working relationship, because y'all both were on two different sides of the aisle. So did it look the same way in the state legislature when you were trying to work with representatives? Or
you find that you have to find some common ground.
mm-hmm.
For example, when I was organizing the Senate, in order to get Michael Figures was a really bright, capable, affable black man who
mm-hmm.
was a state senator from Mobile.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted Michael to be second in command, to be the president pro tem of the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to get the votes to get him elected,
mm-hmm.
I had to meet with state senators and
mm-hmm.
tell them I needed them to vote for Michael Figures for president pro tem.
Mm-hmm.
And invariably, some would say, well, what are you going to do for me? I need a new football stadium for my high school, or I need this road, this road widened, or so you had to figure out how to build common ground.
Yeah.
One Republican, a really wonderful guy who's still around,
mm-hmm.
Jack Biddle, who wanted to be chairman of the Mental Health Committee in the Senate, and it was not a problem. He had an interest in that, so I made him chairman of that committee, mm-hmm. and we were able to build the coalitions that we needed to get things done.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, well, now to you entering governor's race. So do you feel like the positions you had before set you up to be able to understand how governorship worked? Because I feel like
yes.
That's like the perfect track. Like,
yeah,
who could deny that,
Secretary of State has his or her hand in virtually everything that goes on in the state. And being Attorney General, of course, is a good place to learn and to exercise the power of the office to the fullest possible extent to the benefit of the voters and people, citizens. And the office of Lieutenant Governor was a battleground every single day.
Mm.
So it was like going into going into boot camp. You had to, and it was a learning process. So I knew I was ready to run.
Yeah, I love that. So what did you consider your greatest accomplishments as your time as governor?
Well, we did a lot. Even though we lost the battle for the lottery for free college and early learning, we were able to start 70 early learning, model early learning centers throughout the state. We did a lot in education. You mentioned, that I initiated 1,000 new school construction projects. But I think we did a lot of work on victims' rights, particularly children and domestic abuse. Did a lot of work for people who needed health care by increasing the reimbursement rate for doctors and dentists so that they could more easily work with people who were on Medicaid. But bringing in Honda, Toyota, Mercedes, Hyundai, and all these, the hundreds of suppliers, creating really good, high-paying jobs and changing the lives of families, I think was probably the single greatest accomplishment.
Yeah, that's huge. That is so huge.
Still is.
Yeah, it is. I was just going to say to this day. So you spoke about the lottery, the education lottery. That would have created like college scholarships. Was it in the framework of like how Georgia does theirs?
It was identical to Georgia's.
I could have went to college for free.
That's right.
I could have went to college for free. What drove that passion? Because it wasn't just education. You also had wanted to create tech opportunities or something like that, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But we wanted to. It was just a belief that I had that every child, regardless of where they are born, whether it's Mountain Brook or Boise, regardless of what part of the state they're born in or who their parents are, the color of the skin, or whether they're citizens or not, that every child ought to have the right to reach their God-given potential through education.
Yeah.
And you know that opportunity and success has to start with education, and you have to start with preschool. And in addition to giving the kids the wherewithal to be able to compete and succeed in grades K through 12, we would be giving parents a place to drop their children off in the morning, pick them up in the afternoon when they get off work, knowing that their kids are going to be better educated and better equipped to succeed in life.
Yeah.
And then guaranteeing young people, if they stay in school and stay out of trouble and make their grades, that they could get some form of higher education, whether it was job training or a 2-year or 4-year institution. But we felt like, and I felt like, and do feel like, that we need to make that kind of commitment to our young people.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I totally agree. So during your time as governor, you had experienced significant legal challenges. How did that experience affect your view of the justice system?
Well, after I was indicted for something that I knew was just had to be, a political shot.
Yes. I watched the documentary and read the book. I feel like it was BS.
Yeah, but then after I was convicted of something that only occurred in the minds of the prosecutors, that I knew had never happened, that even if it had happened, 113 former state attorneys general, as well as national constitutional scholars, said wasn't a crime anyway, that it was equivalent to appointing an ambassador, because the ambassador had given, money to your campaign. That is just not a crime, and never has been, and isn't a crime. So, knowing that the system could be gamed, that our criminal justice system was flawed, the moment I heard the word guilty, for some reason, I flashed on the fact that as Attorney General, I was required by the Constitution to set execution dates, to ask the Supreme Court to set an execution date for somebody who had been convicted of capital murder. And then as governor, there were eight men who came, not before me, but who had petitioned for clemency, petitioned to get them off death row and into the general population for life without parole. And because I knew that the system was flawed, I just asked God to, forgive me. But it was, it was like, what could I have done?
Yeah.
The system is flawed. But since then, I have spent now years working on death penalty cases.
Yeah.
And I worked with people to get Rocky Myers, who recently was granted clemency by Governor Ivey, and I commend her for her courage in doing that.
Yeah.
But that's a whole nother discussion that I would like to get involved in.
Yeah.
I mean, we have 146 people on death row who likely would not be on death row in any other state. We have more people on Alabama's death row than any other state per capita.
Yep.
Many times we execute more people in 1 year than any other state, as we did last year.
Yeah.
And our sentencing laws are either based on race or reflect race in the outcome. We have 115 people on death row sentenced by non-unanimous juries, such as DeForest Johnson, a black man who was not connected to the murder victim, not connected to the murder scene, and was only connected to the crime based on a person's testimony who was later given $5,000 in exchange for her testimony.
Right.
So we're trying to get a new trial for DeForest Johnson. We have on death row now 29 people who were sentenced by judicial override, which is where the jury says life in prison, the judge says, no, I'm going to kill you anyway.
Yes.
Of those 29 people, 18 are black, which is about 63.3%. Twice as many as whites, 4 times their presence in the population. And every single one who was sentenced, every single black person who was sentenced by judicial override was sentenced by a judge who was running for re-election at the time. The Equal Justice Initiative has shown that judicial overrides in Alabama rose from 7% to over 30% when judges run for re-election.
Wow.
So
It's very sad. Yeah. I'm glad you brought up Rocky because I actually interviewed him last week, 3 days before Governor Ivey granted him clemency.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was able to, I sat down with his lawyer and investigator. He was able to call in and just.
With Casey?
Yeah, Casey and Miriam. Yeah. So just being able to
They're wonderful.
They are.
My hat goes off to them. I mean, they've worked so hard for so long.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's been.
Finally.
Yeah, finally. So I'm glad you brought him up.
Well, thank you for doing that interview.
Yeah. So I want to go over, talk about your book and a documentary. So in 2020, you released your book, Stealing Our Democracy, and you described yourself as someone who had to be stopped. Knowing your story, I see.
Well, I didn't describe myself.
Okay, you didn't describe yourself.
This was Jack Abramoff, who in his book, Capital Punishment, said that I emerged as the first threat to his client.
Okay.
So Yeah, Jack Abramoff was a college Republican friend of Karl Rove's.
Okay.
Bush was getting ready to run for re-election.
Mm-hmm.
Abramoff was representing the Mississippi Choctaw Indians as well as some others, but they put $20 million into the race, both to defeat me and to defeat the education lottery.
Wow.
But he described me as someone who had to be stopped.
Okay, he describes you as someone who had to be stopped. How did that, I mean, you did so many great things. So what specific policies and actions do you think made you a target?
Well, I think, for the Mississippi Choctaw Indians, it was the threat of having a lottery and then maybe the lottery developing into casinos that would be in competition with them. But for Karl Rove and George W. Bush, it was the fact that I had already made a decision to enter the South Carolina primaries to run against George W. Bush.
Oh.
And was going to announce my candidacy after the 2002 elections at the Democratic governors meeting in Washington.
Wow. Are you serious?
Yeah.
That is crazy. That's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, there's more to the story than I knew at the time I wrote the book. But
yeah.
More links to Karl Rove, more links to George W. Bush.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that just made me feel some type of way. I'm sure I'm not the only one that feels some type of way, but okay, moving on.
One of the things that you hinted at the beginning was, what do we do? How do we correct this? How do we stop this from happening? In 1976, the Supreme Court gave prosecutors absolute immunity, immunity from civil liability, meaning in this specific case in 1976, the prosecutor had presented false evidence, false testimony, and had withheld exculpatory evidence which could have made the jury vote for acquittal.
Yeah.
So the court said that even if a prosecutor presents false evidence, false testimony, and withholds exculpatory evidence to get an indictment or a conviction, you can't sue them. Even if they willfully and intentionally lie to get an indictment. Well, since 1976, the Brennan Center says that running up to 1976, mass incarceration hovered around 200,000. After 76, it jumped up to 1.3 million and then up to 2 million. The Death Penalty Information Center did a study in 2021 that showed that for every 8.3 people executed, one person has been exonerated, which means we get it wrong about 12% of the time. This is life or death decisions.
Yep.
Of those people who were exonerated, according to the Death Penalty Information Center, 80% is based on prosecutorial or police misconduct. Of those people exonerated because of misconduct, 87%, 87.9%, I believe, are black, which means prosecutors have been targeting black people for murders they didn't commit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do we stop it? Prosecutors have to be held accountable.
Yeah.
And the only way to do that is to repeal the immunity that has been granted to them by both the 1976 decision and by the United States Congress.
Wow.
No prosecutor in America should be allowed to deliberately frame someone for a crime they did not commit.
Yeah. And what's that? So that was the Supreme Court ruled on that. And is it an immunity act? Like, what's the name of it?
Well, the Federal Tort Claims Act.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's the 1976 Imbler case.
Okay.
And the Federal Tort Claims Act have to be dealt with specifically by Congress. How do we get there? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Trump feels that he has been abused by the system, so you never know.
Right, that's true. That's true. So as you were writing your book and doing the documentary, what was it hard for you to tell your side of the story? Was it like, did it bring up, I don't know,
No.
feelings of, no?
It was not hard for me to tell my side of the story. I felt like I needed to tell my side of the story in order to lay the framework for changing our justice system, to balance the scales of justice, to protect people from the abuse of power of police, prosecutors, or presidents.
Yeah.
And in doing so, we're protecting our Constitution and our democracy. So it was easy for me to tell that story. I didn't have anything to do with the documentary, so I was in prison during the time the documentary was made. And
Okay.
It was released after I got out.
Oh, okay. Did you, from like those experiences, is that what made you start your nonprofit, Advocates for Justice?
Yes, but although I would be advocating for justice whether I had a nonprofit or not. So
Yeah.
it's just, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a good point. You would be doing that regardless. But you specifically, why the death penalty? Like, why is that a passion of yours? Out of all the other.
About 3 years ago, I had an opportunity to meet Lauren Ferrano, who's would be another subject for an interview. But she had just finished with a case, Nathaniel Woods, and anyway, I was invited to speak to a Georgetown Law School class, and I asked Lauren to join me, and from that we got 2 interns, and we asked them to look at all of the people on Alabama's death row and to analyze whether they were sentenced by non-unanimous juries or judicial override, and whether the judges were running for re-election or not. And it was really from the work that these 2 interns did that led me to understand that we have all of these people on death row who might not be on death row if they lived in any other state.
Yeah.
And it's just tragically wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I just have 2 more questions for you. The first one is, how has Alabama politics changed since your time in office? I think it's a very obvious question, but would love your opinion.
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, obviously we moved very far to the right. People are very firm in their and seemingly firm in their beliefs and don't want to compromise and are confrontational. And we've just got to bridge that. And I go back to my first answer to your first question about Secretary of State, what was the most difficult race? This is why I want to encourage people who are thinking about running for office, not only to do social media, but try to bridge the gap by going out and meeting people one-on-one, face-to-face, ask them for their votes. And there's nobody, you've just got to do that. And, if you make those personal contacts and develop a personal relationship, even if it's just a handshake at the door or in the courthouse or in an office building, that is something that someone is going to remember when they get ready to go vote. And whether they're Democrats or Republicans, conservatives or not, they will remember, well, Khadidah came and asked me for my vote. So I'm going to vote for Khadidah.
Okay, see, I just knew you were gonna say that. So what, that's the next question I had was like, what would you say to aspiring and, current political leaders? But you answered that. So my last question is, how do you hope to be remembered in Alabama's political history? I know how I remember you, but how do you want other people to remember you?
Someone who made a difference, someone who cared about people, and yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Governor. This was such an honor to have you on. This is our The South Got Something to Say series. I'm the South, you the South. We're the South, and you had a lot to say today.
Put it in stone.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and we'll see y'all next time. Bye.